Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
I was a little concerned when I looked up and there were 10 kids and 8 pieces of candy. So I went to my office and I had 8 more pieces of candy of a different kind. And I thought, oh no, 8 kids are going to be shortchanged, or 2 kids are going to be shortchanged. But, you know, I think God guided their hands as they reached in, and they each got what they wanted, and we had enough to go around. And so I think it turned out very well. But there's some people that normally supply me with candy, Daryl, and if you happen to go by the store, you might pick that up. But I'll pick some up just in case myself. But he does a good job keeping me supplied. It was 1988. You remember what you were doing? I remember I was a new Christian, and my girlfriend's father asked me, would you like to preach a sermon this Sunday? He had been called to fill in for the preacher in Milburn, Oklahoma. And he said, I'm going to be preaching the Sunday morning and Sunday night, but if you want, you can do the Sunday night lesson. I was 15 years old and been a Christian for maybe 3 months, and so I figured I was the bastion of knowledge to do the lesson. But I told him, yes, I would love to. Of course, you will have to write it for me because I had no idea what I was doing. So we sat down and we put together a lesson on Luke chapter 15. It was the lost chapter of the Bible, and I'm not the one who lost it, but it was about the lost coin and the lost sheep and, of course, the lost son. I remember after the lesson was over, one of the members came up to me and he said, that was a good lesson. What you need to do next now is the love chapter of the Bible. I said, well, what's that? And he said, 1 Corinthians 13. I remember standing in that little church building at the same pulpit I just delivered the lesson from, and I opened this Bible. It was an old King James version that my girlfriend's mom, and of course, you know, that was Julie's mom and dad too. They eventually became my in-laws. But at the time, she was my girlfriend's mother, had given to me for my birthday just a few months earlier. And here I was reading for the first time, as far as I could remember, or even hearing for the first time, Paul's description of love in 1 Corinthians 13. Maybe it's not one of those moments like, where were you when Kennedy got shot? Or where were you when the space shuttle exploded? Or where were you when the towers fell? Maybe it's not that big of an impact or that big of an idea, but Paul's description of the more excellent way is really a bigger deal than any one of those things. Because the impact of 1 Corinthians 13 is far more reaching than any political event or any national event that happens. Because it centers around love. We think about love. We think about 1 Corinthians 13. It comes to mind. But what we want to look at tonight is that Paul's description is really about love in action. If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to turn to 1 Corinthians 13. If you make notes in your Bibles, you might underline something here or learn something or add a note that may later jog your memory. It was Jonathan Swift, an Irish satirist and author of Gulliver's Travels, among other things, who once said that we have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough religion to make us love one another. That's quite a telling statement, isn't it? Because what he is seeing is that religion often divides us up and causes competition from one person to the next person. That competition often escalates into hate, even to the point of war between nations and rivalry, combating conflicting tribes and so forth. And so he was saying here we have just enough religion to make us hate, to see our differences, but not quite enough to see love unite us the way that it ought to. It calls to mind how religion, especially in our modern society, has received such a negative reputation. There's a popular saying, we've said it before, but among a lot of people, I am spiritual but not religious. trying to distance themselves from the idea of religiosity, but I am a spiritual person. I am better than all of those who are merely religious. I am spiritual. But what is amazing is no matter how far we might distance ourselves from one or from the idea of religion, you can call it whatever you want. It really doesn't fix the problem. The problem is that love is lacking a lot of times. The central tenet of Jesus' teaching is love. Atheists know that, and agnostics know that, humanists know that, Buddhists knows that, Muslims know that. Everyone on earth knows that the central tenet of Christianity is love, and so they know that that's what we're supposed to be about. The problem is that as they look at those people who claim to be Christians, they're not seeing a lot of love practiced in Christianity. And I use Christianity there in its widest possible meaning, not necessarily what the New Testament calls a Christian, but what the world calls a Christian. We know that we can make the distinction because we read the Bible and we know those differences. But the world is not concerned about those differences. The world simply looks at us as a whole and says there's not enough love coming from Christianity. John, I think, identifies for us really part of that problem in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 18 when he says, "Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." Even in the first century, there was a danger of Christians talking about their love for the lost or their love for the church or their love for one another, but not showing it in deed and in truth. That's not a danger that happens in the 21st century, or we just developed last century in the 20th century. In the very first century, that was an issue. Be careful that your love is not just about talking about it, but actually doing something. Love is about action, not talk. And John's not the only one who demonstrated that. Jesus taught those very words. And of course, Paul. Paul deals with the very same theme as he discusses that more excellent way of 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 31. In the midst of his discussion on spiritual gifts and the Corinthians' abuse of those miraculous gifts, he encourages them to seek a higher gift, one that exceeds them all, he would say. Higher than the miracles, higher than the power of God, manifest as a sign on this earth. Yes, something even greater than miracles. A gift of higher quality, a gift of a higher plane, the gift of a higher mind than the bite and devour attitudes that they had demonstrated over miracles at the church in Corinth. That higher way was the way of love. So tonight I want to take just a moment to look at this way of love in action as described by Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. It divides itself into four simple divisions, the prologue, the acts, the comparison, and the epilogue. We're going to focus on, though, the beginning, what we might call the need for love, and we'll follow it up with the value of love. Let's look first at the need for love. Paul clued them in, I should say, to the more excellent way. And he begins by showing religious demonstration without love is useless. No matter what you can show with your faith, even if it is a merciful and compassionate action towards someone who is in need or someone who is lost, if it is done without the motivation of love, Paul's declaration is that it is still useless. Notice what he says in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 1. "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." Paul uses the same formula in verses 1, 2, and 3, in which he states something that we can have that would be amazing, and then he goes into the hyperbole that says we can't even attain this, it's impossible, but even if we could have that, and then he extinguishes the greatness of it and says, but it would amount to nothing without love. And he says, for instance, here in this first one, if I speak in the tongues of men, that's in the eyes of the Corinthians, that was one of the greatest gifts that you could have, was to speak in tongues. Yes, it was a gift of the Holy Spirit. In 1 Corinthians 12, verses 8 through 10, he gives that catalog of the different miracles that they were able to perform. The speaking in tongues was one of them. Paul puts it here, I think, at the front of the list because the Corinthians would have put it at the front of the list. And then he breaks it off. He takes it away. If I can speak in the tongues of men. Yes, Paul, how great that is. Even if I could do the impossible and speak in the tongues of angels. Now there's question whether or not there's an actual tongue or language of the angels which men do not know. Is there a heavenly language that we can attain to or not attain to? It really doesn't matter if there really is an actual language there or no language at all, but the idea is if we could attain to such a thing, to attain to the speaking with the angels while on this earth. Impossible. Paul knows that. But he's setting up the hyperbole. If we could speak in tongues of men, even to the extent of speaking in the language of heaven, but I don't have love, then I'm just noise. In verse 2, and if I have prophetic powers, understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. He goes back to the catalog of the miracles. If I have all prophetic powers, if I understand all the mysteries, that is, if I'm able to foretell the future, all prophetic powers, and if I have all understanding, if I am omniscient. Well, we know that man is not omniscient. While the Son was on this earth, he says, of that day and that hour knows no one, not even the Son of Man. We don't attain to omniscience, but Paul is saying, if I had prophetic powers and could obtain to all omniscience, if I had knowledge, the miraculous knowledge from chapter 12, if I had this miraculous faith so as to remove mountains, but I don't have love, it amounts to nothing. To have all omniscience, to have all faith, to have these things, he says, even moving the mountains, it's useless without love. And then in verse 3, if I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Here again, if I give away, if I have the heart of compassion and benevolence to others, and I give everything of my possessions, of my resources away to others to help benefit their life, that would be a great thing. Even if I delivered myself up for burning, to burn ourselves, but I don't have love, it brings nothing. We are left then to understand that the greatest feats of faith fall short of glorious when they're not motivated and sustained by love. All that we do, all that presses us on and spurs us to the sacrifices that we make and the knowledge that we share, to the words which we speak, all of those must be motivated by love and sustained by love. Otherwise, everything we do amounts to nothing. But then that leaves us begging a question. What is love that I may use it to spur my actions? How am I to understand love in a case like that? So we look at the acts of love to find out what that is. In verses 4 through 7, Paul gives us a series of 15 verbs. He describes love, but it isn't just a mushy retelling of how love feels. Love feels like a flower. Love feels like a cloud. It's not about the love and how it feels. Paul defines love in actions, not with a list of adjectives, but in verbs. It's a series of deeds. Love does. If we learn nothing else from that, love does. The present tense of the verbs suggests that it's something that is being expressed and is continued to being expressed over practice and habit of time. Christian love is a lifetime of choice, not a checklist. I was good to someone once. I was kind the other day. I did this and I did that. I'm done. But rather, love is something that is ongoing, time and time and time again. Love, if we look at the actual verses, beginning in verse 4, love, he says, is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. We kind of lose some of the punch of these lines because we don't have really a verb form of the word patience. We understand what it means to suffer injury and injustice with goodwill. We understand the concept of patience, but what he's saying is that love actively, or love takes the action of patience. It's not just an existence. You know, we learned many years ago, am, is, are, was, were, right? The verbs of being, or I never really understood that until I put the idea of existence with it. These are the verbs that speak of existence. I think, therefore I am. Am, is, are, was, were. They speak of how things exist. Love doesn't just exist in patience. If I could coin a word, maybe love patiates. I know that's not a real word. But if we could say it that way, love kindifies. I'm not real good at making up verbs, Justin. I apologize. But if I could turn these words into the verbs that the Greek has for us, it's an action. It's not something that we just feel or that we want to move into a state of. It is doing. And that's the important part. And it's not that these words are hard for us to understand. We know patience. We know what kindness is. We understand what envy is and what boasting is. And he begins with two positives, patience and kindness. And then he goes into a litany of the negatives. It's not jealous. It is not arrogant or not envious, not arrogant, not rude. It does not insist on its own way. When children are small and they're playing outside and one wants to go play hide and seek and the other says, no, we're going to play tag. And then before you know it, they're scuffling on the ground and hitting one another because they're each insisting on their own way. And we're teaching them that that's not love. Love is not about its own way. It does not seek its own advantage. Love is not irritable. That is, it's not easily to stir up into ire and strife. Love is not resentful. The idea of cantankerous even. Love, he says, it does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices rather with the truth. Love bears all things and believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. I say all of those to get us to the end of this matter. I don't think we have a hard time understanding those words or those concepts. But there's three things when we get to this point that I want us to understand. Three truths about the background for love and for understanding what Paul is talking about. And the first one is the dynamic nature of love. Love is dynamic. Love, like faith, is not attested by mere words, I love you. But it is attested by the accompanying actions. For example, if you speak of love while treating someone rudely, that betrays that declaration of love. We cannot speak of love and keep a record of all the times that we've been offended. Because in that keeping a record, there is an implication that I'm keeping this record to one day get even. I'm going to settle the score here. Love is not about the words which we speak so much as they are about the actions that we take. What love does and does not do, that's exactly what Paul is painting for us. And dynamic love, like Paul is talking about, is a life devoid of ego. Think about it. Love does not insist on its own advantage. Well, who insists on their own advantage or their own way? The egotistical. Love is not rude. Who is rude? Those who are egotistical. Love is not arrogant. Who is arrogant? The egotistical. The one who views life as being centered around them. I know years and years and years ago, everyone thought that the world revolved around the earth. We learned better and realize now that the earth revolves around the sun. But there's a lot of people with a high degree of egotism that thinks the universe revolves around them. That's not love. Love is dynamic about seeking things outside of ourselves. Second, sometimes we look at 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7 especially. We read it at wedding reception or weddings, and we think of this as Paul's ode to love or Paul's hymn of love. But really, it's not Paul's ode or hymn to love. What it is Paul's rebuke to the Corinthians. You see, keep that central when reading the chapter. In fact, keep it central in reading the entire book. This is not only Paul's rebuke, but it is the answer to all the turmoil and division in Corinth. Everything Paul says love does, the Corinthians were not doing. And everything Paul says that love does not do is exactly what the Corinthians were doing. You could take the reverse of those entire 4 verses and see them throughout the entire book. Envy, for example. Love does not envy, and yet the divisiveness and the party spirit in the church at Corinth was all about envy. 7 times in the entire New Testament, the word puffed up is used. 6 of those times are in 1 Corinthians. He says love is not puffed up. The other 5 times he uses it, he's telling the Corinthians, don't be puffed up. Because they were being puffed up over different things, like that pride was at the root of their division. It was at the root of their challenge of Paul and his authority. Love does not seek its own advantage, but Paul has to tell the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10:24 not to seek their own advantage. In verse 33 of chapter 10, he says, just as I try to please everyone and everything, I do not seek my own advantage, but that of the many, that they may be saved. And then the very next verse, if you take out the chapter break with 11, the very next verse is, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. What does that mean, Paul? It means don't seek your own advantage. Seek the advantage in the salvation of others. Love does not act indecently, yet they succored the man who was with his father's wife. They allowed the frequenting of a prostitute, and Paul sets them aside. Paul is really giving the rebuke. And why that's important is because the answer for the church at Corinth is the same as the answer for us today. When we face division, when we face lethargy, when we face all the things that threaten the church, the answer is love. And then finally, to understand and grasp this background is to understand that all that love does or does not do are exemplified by God. God shows love. In fact, the verse says, God is love. Think about it. If you were to take verses 4 through 7 and change out the word love with God, God is patient and kind. God does not envy or boast. He is not arrogant or rude. He does not insist on his own way. He is not irritable or resentful. He does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. God bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Paul is not just willy-nilly pulling these verbs out of thin air. He saw them in Corinth, and he saw them in God. We might call it being like God or God-likeness. And Paul concludes the entire discussion with the eternal triad. So now faith, hope, and love abide, continue eternally. These 3, but the greatest of them, he says, is love. When all the things that the Corinthians prized give way to time and fail, he says faith, hope, and love will stand. Even the miracles that they love so much, he says, they are going to pass away, but faith, hope, and love will endure. And so today, while we do not have the miracles of the first century, we still have faith, hope, and love. And when the trumpet sounds and Jesus comes in the clouds, the things that will still stand are faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. It answers all the issues of life: pride, prejudice, division within the church, lethargy and non-work, factions and heresy, soundness, right doctrine, having the answer to every question, teasing out the truth of every issue is essential to being Christ's church. Compassion and mercy and benevolence and correct worship are all necessary to be Christ's church. But all of those things without love amount to nothing. We're just unprofitable noise without love. So we let our light shine. We challenge our world. But we've got to quit saying we love souls. We've got to quit saying it. And we've got to start showing it. Because love is not about the words. Love is about the action. Love is more than words. Love does. The beginning of love is here. As Jesus would say in John 14 and verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Here's where our love begins. It moves in the direction of God by obeying the gospel. And there are some tonight who are here who have not obeyed the gospel. And it doesn't matter how much you say, I love you. If we cannot keep the commandments of God, we're saying, I really don't. But the challenge is to you to keep your life right with Him. To love Him enough to obey His gospel. Being baptized for the remission of your sins, He will add you to His church. If tonight you love God, if tonight you're ready to give your life over to Him, and you're ready to quit saying, I love you, and you're ready to start showing, I love you, then we ask you to come and respond to His invitation while we stand and while we sing.
And you've been to Jesus for that